If you know one thing about the dire wolf, it's probably from Game of Thrones, a darker, bigger, scarier version of a regular wolf. And for a long time, that's basically what scientists thought it was too. Just a supersized cousin of the gray wolf that got left behind in the Ice Age. Every wolf documentary, every piece of paleo art, every museum diorama treated it as essentially a large, muscular gray wolf with a bad attitude. Except that turned out to be almost completely wrong. The real dire wolf shared its world with the American lion, hunted in the same packs of dozens, and left behind more fossils than almost any other predator that ever lived in North America. And then, in 2025, a biotech company claimed they'd brought it back from extinction. So what actually was this animal? And did anyone really bring it back? The story starts in the summer of 1854, on the banks of the Ohio River near Evansville, Indiana. The water was unusually low that year, and a local collector named Francis Link found a strange jawbone sticking out of the riverbank. It made its way to the paleontologist Joseph Leidy, the same man who would later describe the American lion. Leidy realized this was something new, a wolf unlike any living species, and gave it a name. Then he had to change that name because it turned out to already belong to a different animal. He tried again a few years later and finally landed on Canis dirus, meaning fearsome dog. It would take more than a century and thousands of additional bones, mostly from the Brea Tar Pits in California, before scientists really understood what they were dealing with. For well over 100 years, the dire wolf was treated as a close relative of the gray wolf, just bigger and heavier. Then in 2021, a team of researchers managed to sequence ancient DNA from several dire wolf fossils, and the results stunned the paleontology world. The dire wolf wasn't closely related to gray wolves at all. In fact, it split off from the ancestors of all living wolf-like canines more than 5 million years ago, evolving entirely on its own in the Americas, while gray wolves, coyotes, and jackals were doing their own thing over in Eurasia and Africa. Genetically, the dire wolf actually sits closer to African jackals and African wild dogs than it does to the wolf it's named after. The similarities in size and shape between dire wolf and gray wolves turned out to be a case of convergent evolution, two unrelated lineages independently arriving at the same basic body plan because it worked. The discovery was such a big deal that the dire wolf had kicked out of the genus Canis entirely and placed into its own genus, Anoscion, meaning terrible wolf. So technically calling it a dire wolf was right, calling it a wolf really wasn't. In terms of raw size, the dire wolf wasn't dramatically bigger than the largest gray wolves alive today, the big ones you'd find in Alaska. What set it apart was how it was built. It had a wider, more heavily muscled skull, a larger sagittal crest for anchoring its jaw muscles, and teeth that were noticeably more robust than a modern wolf's. All of that added up to serious bite force, roughly 129% that of a gray wolf, making it the strongest bite of any known placental mammal relative to its size. Its canines were also rounder and more flexible than a gray wolf's, which is a shape better suited to grappling and holding on to struggling prey rather than a single precision bite. This wasn't an animal built for speed and endurance chases the way gray wolves are. It was built to grab something big and not let go. And something big is an understatement. Based on typical pack hunting predator behavior, researchers estimate dire wolves were taking down prey in the 300 to 600 kilogram range, animals like ancient bison, horses, camels, and occasionally young mammoths. Isotope analysis from bones at La Brea backs this up, showing bison and horse made up the bulk of their diet, with ground sloth and mastodon rounding things out. Getting an animal that size on the ground took teamwork, and everything about the fossil record suggests dire wolves lived and hunted in large, coordinated packs, likely bigger than the packs modern gray wolves form today. A remarkable number of dire wolf specimens also show broken and heavily worn teeth, evidence of a life spent crunching through bone and fighting other predators for scraps, in a landscape that was brutally competitive. The Brea Tar Pits in California weren't just a graveyard for one predator, they were a graveyard for nearly all of them, and dire wolves came out on top by a wide margin. Over 4,000 individual dire wolves have been pulled from the asphalt there, making it by far the single most common predator ever found at the site, more common than the lion, more common even than Smilodon. The same trap that caught them all worked the same grim way. A herbivore gets stuck, starts struggling and crying out, and every nearby predator comes running for what looks like an easy meal, only to get stuck themselves. It's a horrible way to end up in the fossil record, but it's the reason paleontologists know as much as they do about how these wolves actually lived. Sharing that landscape with Smilodon, the short-faced bear, and the American lion meant dire wolves were far from the top of the food chain by default. For years, paleoart loved to show dire wolves and Smilodon locked in constant bloody battles over kills, and there was almost certainly some truth to that.
But more recent research complicates the picture. A study looking at how these predators actually used the landscape found dire wolves tended to hunt more in open grassland, while Smilodon and other big cats leaned toward denser, more wooded terrain, chasing different prey in different places. That doesn't mean these animals never crossed paths or fought over a carcass. It just means the constant all-out war between them may have been less common than old documentaries made it look. Real competition existed, but so did more separation than anyone assumed. Then there was the short-faced bear, Arctodus simus, a genuine giant that could stand taller than a grizzly on its hind legs. A single short-faced bear could probably walk up to a pack of dire wolves mid-kill and simply take over through sheer size and intimidation, no fight required. Surviving in this neighborhood meant dire wolves needed the one advantage none of these bigger, more heavily armed predators had: numbers. A lone Smilodon or a lone short-faced bear was more powerful than a lone dire wolf, but a coordinated pack of a dozen or more dire wolves was a very different problem, and that's likely exactly why they hunted the way they did. Dire wolves vanished in the same wave of extinctions that took out the American lion, Smilodon, the short-faced bear, and nearly every other large predator and herbivore in North America, right around 11 to 13,000 years ago. The same two forces are usually blamed: a rapidly warming climate that reshaped the open grasslands these predators depended on, and the arrival of highly effective human hunters who were putting pressure on the same megafauna. Researchers have found evidence of a startlingly fast ecological collapse, with large mammal populations crashing within just a few centuries. For a predator this specialized, built specifically to team up and take down enormous prey, that kind of collapse left nothing to fall back on. Once the bison, horses, and camels disappeared, there simply wasn't enough left to feed packs of animals this size, and the direwolf disappeared along with them. Except, according to one biotech company, maybe it didn't disappear after all. In April of 2025, a company called Colossal Biosciences announced the birth of 3 wolf pups named Romulus, Remus, and Khaleesi, and claimed they had successfully de-extincted the direwolf. It made headlines everywhere. Here's what they actually did. Using ancient DNA pulled from a 13,000-year-old tooth and a 72,000-year-old ear bone, Colossal scientists identified around 20 genetic differences across 14 genes that separate dire wolves from gray wolves, mostly related to size, skull shape, and coat color. They then edited those genes into gray wolf cells and cloned the result. No actual ancient dire wolf DNA was spliced into the animals. What you end up with, genetically, is a gray wolf, just with a small, deliberately chosen set of dire wolf-like traits layered on top. Scientists outside the company pushed back almost immediately. Geneticists pointed out that dire wolves and gray wolves are separated by millions of years and enormous stretches of DNA, and that changing 20 genes out of many thousands of differences doesn't undo that gap. Colossal's own chief scientist eventually clarified that the animals are, in her words, gray wolves with 20 edits designed to make them look like dire wolves, which is a considerably more modest claim than the dire wolf is back. Whatever you want to call Romulus, Remus, and Khaleesi, they aren't a population of Enochiandirus walking the earth again. They're a glimpse of what real de-extinction might eventually look like, wrapped in a headline that ran a little ahead of the science. So the next time direwolves come up, whether it's from a fantasy show or a biotech headline, you'll know the real story is stranger than the fiction. A predator that wasn't really a wolf at all, that hunted in massive packs across an entire continent and left behind more fossils than almost anything else from the Ice Age, only to vanish alongside the world it was built for. If you enjoyed learning about the real direwolf, let me know in the comments and subscribe for more forgotten giants of the Ice Age.